Catholic faith teaches us that when we're present to the God who is present to us in the Eucharist, there's this wonderful way in which we are present to all the living and the dead. Right? So I think there's a tremendous consolation in that whether we're in the, kind of as St. John Paul II put it, the humblest country church or the most magnificent cathedral, to be there in the presence of God is also to be present to all the living and the dead. Right? You try this one more time. All right. We've got a green light. Green lights are usually good. We're going to first have an image by Raúl Berzosa, who's a contemporary Spanish painter. He does really wonderful work. But this is an image that incorporates both the Holy Trinity and the Holy Family. All right, those are going to be kind of the two touchstones between which I want to think about faith and art and how the two combine in the formation of culture. Right? So we are, of course, social creatures, and all of art and culture there it is. Okay. All of our culture invariably hinges on our being social creatures. Right? It thus belongs to us who long for the invigoration of the arts and the restoration of culture to give generously to one another, sharing our gifts, our resources, and our time, so that we all can be nourished from the abundance God has shared with us, an abundance which flows from the life of the Trinity. All legitimate art and culture ultimately proceeds from the Trinitarian creativity of God and seeks to raise our limited human society to contemplation of the divine society to which life in Christ calls us. It takes no close scrutiny of our culture, and with it, the state of our art, to find elements which cry out for renovation, and in many cases, total rejection. Popular music revels in rank sensuality and greed, in the desire for revenge and the delight in the downfall of our enemies. Much of our modern painting and sculpture either reduces the forms of things to the point of absurdity, or doing away with form altogether, serves to express the artist's subjectivity in a manner almost totally opaque to the viewer. Many of the supposedly most important novels of our day are simply the ones which most provocatively embody the values of the moment. In short, far from creating opportunities for transcendence, many of our artists have given themselves over to developing propaganda. And our culture, far from fostering a spirit of worship, which inundates all areas of life, has become a forum for the worship of the self. Right, so I often kind of wish, in a tongue-in-cheek way, as I drive around the city, seeing some of the monuments which now have nothing on top of them, and that, of course, is a conversation for a different time. But I'm often struck by the fact that, like, it now looks like we're just kind of worshiping nothingness, and I kind of wish we would just put like mirrors up there to reflect like the fact that in many ways we're just kind of constantly worshiping ourselves in modern culture. I don't think they're going to go for that idea submitted it to the city. They have not gotten back to me yet. We'll see. Looking about at the postmodern, post-Christian, post-meaning, post-value, post-human decadence of the Western world, it is tempting to recall and to take to heart the inscription of Percy Shelley's King Ozymandias, right, who concludes his like inscription to the world, "Look on my works and despair," right? So we see this image of the Egyptian monument collapsed in the sand, right? This great, powerful figure, right, who raised this monument to himself and now is crumbling, looking upon nothing, right? So Shelley gives us this image of kind of the futility of much of human cultural endeavor, right? Or we can think about the inscription that Dante has carved on the gates of hell at the beginning of his Inferno in the Divine Comedy. "Abandon every hope, you who enter here." All right, I think this is often the feeling that we encounter when we take a look at our culture, right? It just seems so bad, right? That there seems to be very little reason to hope in what is presented to us. Things are not perhaps as dire as that. The very impulse to create art, an impulse as old as the human race, speaks to man's fundamentally religious nature. Anyone who makes a work of art, however shoddy its quality or misguided its message, has heard the promptings of the divine and has committed to an encounter with reality. Everyone who creates must some level recognize the goodness of the world and of our fellow creatures, right? So it's impossible to be totally nihilistic and also try to be an artist, right? Because to be an artist is in some way to say that the world is good and that I want to share that goodness with other people, right? Otherwise, we just wouldn't create art at all. Yet the imperfections of our day, multiplied and focused through the myriad lenses of social media, identity politics, and technologically driven advertising, can indeed make the situation feel hopeless. It belongs to us, however, to hold fast to hope, and to let that hope move us to the reclamation of art and culture through faith, so that an account of our hope might go forth into the world. Passing through this strange land, we ought to look carefully for the signposts left behind by those who have preceded us in hope, and to leave signposts of our own to guide those who will come after. This is, of course, no small task. Often, faced with the enormity of the labor before us, we can feel inclined to give in, to capitulate before overwhelming odds, or simply to isolate ourselves, avoiding exposure to the noxious influences of the world, certainly, but doing little to purify the air. Thanks be to God that He has not left us to do the work alone. In the church to which He Eucharistically unites us, He supplies us not only with a wellspring of beauty to which we can turn for refreshment and inspiration, but also with a history in which we can find both admonition and solace. Not only that, but in every wellspring of authentic artistic development, He has left us with a sign, a touchstone to guide us. This evening, I would like to consider in particular how Scripture, in which the church hands down to us, offers us a sure model for the work of building culture and enlivening art through our faith. So the first kind of main leg of this journey is going to be to look at the history of salvation in the Old Testament to see what does God tell us about how to make art, right? And how to be faithful in making art, and thus how to bring about authentic culture. And then from there, we're going to look at sort of how Jesus transforms that art and culture building process, and sort of what is left for us to do today. All culture constitutes embodied religion, as Dr. Jordan Hada, who began this lecture series, notes in his essay in the first issue of Joie de Vivre Journal. So I do have some copies of that here, and I'll be selling them outside after, if you want to get your hands on some good art and culture immediately. But Dr. Hada, in saying that all culture is embodied religion, is following on the work of Dr. Christopher Dawson, right, who's a British Catholic historian. Culture is a function of worship, right? Whether we worship the natural world or our own selves or the God through whom the universe came to be. The development of language, of poetry, of visual art, of stories, all depends on man's reaching out to God. But our own reaching out to God is always a response. Man does not reach blindly into a blind universe, but rather turns his eyes to the God whose eye is always upon him. And so in considering the development of culture, we ought to begin with the fundamental culture upon which the universe depends, the culture of the Trinity, from whose love the created order springs. In the beginning, Genesis tells us, God created the heavens and the earth. St. Augustine, reflecting on this passage, surmised that the phrase, in the beginning, doesn't just mean the kind of temporal start of all things, but rather that the beginning is the Word, right? So when Genesis talks about God creating things in the beginning, it's not just saying that He kind of launched time into motion, but rather that He looked at His Son, and rejoicing in His Son, in that Son, created all things. It's through the Word, through the act of speaking the divine love of the Son, that God creates the various parts of the universe, including man. Adam, we see here naming the animals. This is a painting by Jan Bruegel. Adam, formed in God's image and likeness, is almost immediately given a share in God's creative activity. God, having just finished creating the world and declaring its elements good, suddenly and strikingly declares, it is not good that the man should be alone. So this is a little bit jarring in Genesis, right? That throughout the 7-day creation story, God has said again and again, it is good, right? God saw that it was good. God saw that it was very good. And now suddenly He's completed this work of creation, and He turns to Adam and He says, it is not good that the man should be alone. Thus, he leads the animals before Adam, one by one, and Adam names them, right? So this is, of course, the process of looking for a suitable partner for Adam. And of course, it's somewhat comical to imagine Adam like going through this parade of animals, like, the giraffe, very tall, a little too tall. I don't think this is going to work out, right? The hippo, she's a little large, right? But there's also this process in which Adam is being given a share in God's creative activity, right? That though Adam's words cannot create things like God's can, they nonetheless have a binding power over reality. Adam's words, that is, reflect the divinely created reality of the world. But none of the animals is a fitting companion for Adam, for he cannot see himself in them. And so God casts Adam into a deep sleep and draws a rib from his side and fashions it into Eve. And now at last, looking at Eve, seeing himself reflected in her eyes, Adam can say, "This at last is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh." Looking upon each other, Adam and Eve, clothed in the glory of God, have some experience of the life of the Trinity, of God looking upon himself, Father, Son, and Spirit, each seeing themselves in the other and delighting in themselves in the other. Already at this early stage, Adam and Eve, walking with God in the cool of the evening, conversing with him and learning his heart, enjoy a cultural experience of the most profound sort, a worship which affords contemplation of God. Yet, by this time, Satan has fallen like lightning from the sky, beginning even in the moment of his first rebellion to establish an anti-culture, a worship directed not to God, but to himself. And in his conversation with Eve, we see the first of many examples Scripture provides us of how not to build culture and how not to engage with cultures contrary to God's. So we hear a lot today about the process of enculturation. How does the church respond to the culture that's around us? And in many ways, the interaction between Eve and the serpent gives us an example of how not to go about this process of enculturation. The serpent, we recall, approaches Eve with a question. Did God really say, "You shall not eat from any of the trees in the garden"? We hear questions like this echoed a lot in our contemporary culture, right? Did God really tell you not to do that? Did he really say that marriage is between a man and a woman? Did he really say not to kill? Did he really say that you should rest on Sunday? Eve's response is easy to pass over without much notice. She says, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. It is only about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, 'You shall not eat it or even touch it, or else you will die.'" Now, this isn't exactly what God said. To some degree, she's putting words in God's mouth, right? Because all God said was don't eat it. He didn't say anything about touching it. Now, it's probably a good inference, right, that you probably should not touch things that you shouldn't eat. And yet there's a way in which Eve, in this interaction with the serpent, is already departing from conversation with God, right? There's a hint that there's a question in her heart, right? She's wondering, why did God do this? Why is it that I'm not supposed to eat this? There's this questioning within her. And rather than bringing that questioning to God, she brings it to the serpent. Right? The two of them have this colloquy. She looks at the fruit and sees that it is good for food, pleasing to the eyes, and desirable for wisdom. It is, in a word, beautiful. And she gives herself to the beauty of the created thing rather than to the most eminent beauty of the Creator. The serpent's promises, of course, come true, though not in the way Eve expected. Her eyes are open, right? The serpent has said, your eyes will be open and you will be like God. Right, now the really curious thing is the way that he has so subtly trapped both her and Adam, right? We remember, of course, that Scripture tells us that Adam was right there next to her, right? So so he fails as well, right? And not stepping in and not stopping this interaction from proceeding, right? But Adam and Eve are already like God. They've been created in the image and likeness of God. They don't need to reach out and grasp at being like him. The one they become like is the serpent. Right? And why is that? Because their eyes are do serpents not have eyelids? Their eyes are always open, right? And so in the ancient world, this would have been a symbol that readers would have recognized immediately, right? That, oh, they became like the serpent. So he tells them the truth, right? Your eyes will be opened. You'll be like me, okay? Like the one who from the beginning has sought to put himself in the position of God. The tempter desires, of course, that we be not like God, but rather like himself, like the serpent. That we no longer rejoice in the other, right? And this is another one of the tragic moments of the Genesis story, right? That immediately, right, when God begins to question Adam and Eve, it's heartbreaking to see the way that Adam turns against God and Eve, right? When God asks him, what happened, right? Well, this woman that you gave me this fruit to eat, right? So it's her fault, it's your fault. It's not my fault. Mirroring again the activity of the serpent, right? Who of course always deflects blame from himself. This kind of culture of consumption, right? So Adam and Eve turned from a culture of contemplation, right? Of looking at God and delighting in him, and looking at each other and delighting in each other, and looking at themselves and being delighted at themselves, so fearfully and wonderfully made. They turned from that culture of contemplation to a culture of consumption. That culture continues in the line of Cain. So after the memorable account of Cain's jealous murder of Abel, the text of Genesis supplies us with a history of Cain's descendants, with a few points of cultural reflection dropped kind of subtly into the text. We are told in passing, for instance, that Cain became the founder of a city, and that the progeny of his descendant Lamech became the producers of the things that we associate with culture. Jabel's line dwells in tents and keeps livestock. Jubal sires all those who play the lyre and the reed pipe. And Tubal-Cain became the father of those who make tools of bronze and iron. Now, in a line of men who have turned away from God, Lamech himself presents the most deliberate turning away. He has 2 wives, and he terrorizes them with stories of the murders he has committed on the slightest pretext. All right, so he has this way, this passage where basically he says, wives, I kill people, don't mess with me, right? And what's really shocking, I didn't realize this until the other day, what's really shocking about this passage is, of course, so Genesis kind of switches back and forth between prose and poetry. The poetic sections being kind of reserved for the most beautiful, the most fundamental, most critical, lovely, important passages. And Lamech, basically sings a song of murderous rage to his wives, right? This is these lines are cast in the form of poetry, right, rather than in prose, right? And so in these cities of Cain, right, we find a portrait of society far different from that of Eden. In them, we have the products of culture. But when that culture is not dedicated to the Lord, but rather to the self, when the arts and sciences turn not to God, but only to man, then culture itself becomes the occasion for luxury as well as for violence. And in this respect, the culture of Lamech, which makes poetry of violence and inflicts that violence upon others, especially women, is not too far from our own. Right, so you don't have to look far in the catalog of gangster rap to find a lot of songs that are similar in some ways to Lamech's. As the world of Genesis worsens, as culture overflows into every kind of evil, we nonetheless see in Noah a very fine example of good art in the service of true culture. Having determined to spare Noah, God does not simply whisk Noah and the animals to safety. Rather, he gives Noah instructions as to how to build the ark. And the result is a massive boat, which, with its opening at the top to let in air and light, resembles many churches, in fact. Right, so I kind of put side by side this kind of reconstruction of the ark and St. Paul outside the walls, right? One of the really kind of the 4 big churches in Rome. And it's very curious to note that the instructions that God gives to Noah are in many ways very similar to kind of the plan for churches, right? Especially with the positioning of the windows to let in light and air. So good art flows from our listening to the Lord, and that listening in turn allows the work of human hands to become life-giving, to enact fruitful cultural forms which allow for authentic worship and the salvation of man. As usual, though, we humans screw things up. Noah himself falls victim to the wine he later cultivates, right, bringing about the curse on his son Ham. And the human society reconstituted through Noah, sharing one language, hits upon the idea of building a tower with its top in the sky in order to make a name for themselves, lest they be scattered all over the earth. We see the similarity here with Adam and Eve. Just as the two first parents, created in the image of God, tried to become like gods and made themselves like the serpent instead, so the people of Babylon, already gathered together, united in language, drove themselves apart through their hubris. And they did so using bricks, right? So they used these six-sided implements, right? Remember the number 6 scripturally indicates this lack of perfection. It's coming just short, of perfection, right? So they use these six-sided things to build this monument to themselves, right? And thus, in a way, prefigure the labor of Israel in Egypt. And it's here in Egypt and in the Israelites' journey out of bondage to Pharaoh and into the freedom of true worship that I'd like to focus our study of the relationship between art and faith in the Old Testament. Through Joseph's wisdom, we recall that Israelites had prospered exceedingly in Egypt. In fact, they'd done so well for themselves that the Egyptians were selling themselves into slavery to Pharaoh. But as time passed and a new Pharaoh came to power, one who knew nothing of Joseph, the people found themselves in cruel bondage, forced to build Pharaoh's garrisons, so harshly beset that they no longer had the capacity for true worship. And here's a critical point. It's easy to consider the narrative of Exodus as simply the process of Israel's being led from slavery into freedom. And this is, of course, what happened. But we need to consider what we mean by freedom. Was it simply that God desired his suffering people to be freed from Pharaoh's tyranny? Certainly God remembers his children and seeks to deliver them from evil. But at a more fundamental level, God wanted to be united with his children, not simply to see them free of the influence of the cruel false father, the idol of Pharaoh, but to make them free to be one with him in worship. Exodus is the tale of Israel's journey back to worship, and this is the tale of all of our lives in Christ, a process of being set free from our slavery to our passions, our desires, our possessions, our wants, so that we can be free for worship. After all, heaven itself is nothing but the eternal contemplative worship of the triune God, a worship whereby we share in the very life of that blessed Trinity. As the Israelites show us, art is one of the key means whereby we can form a culture of faith. But for that art to form a faithful culture, it must be undertaken under the guidance of God. Let's consider what happens at Mount Sinai. So Moses and the people arrive there in the 3rd month of wandering in the wilderness of Sin. They pitch their camp, and on the 3rd day, God descends upon the mountain in his great theophany. Moses goes up and receives the 10 Commandments and ratifies the covenant between God and the people by sprinkling the sacrificial blood of bulls upon the altar as well as upon Israel. He then receives further instructions from the Lord, beginning with a list of materials to collect from the people. So the Lord says, "Speak to the Israelites. Let them receive contributions for me. From each you shall receive the contribution that their hearts prompt them to give me. These are the contributions you shall accept from them: gold, silver, and bronze, violet, purple, and scarlet yarn, fine linen and goat hair, ram skins dyed red, and tahash skins, acacia wood, oil for the light, spices for the anointing oil and for the fragrant incense, onyx stones and other gems for mounting on the ephod and the breastpiece. There to make a sanctuary for me, that I may dwell in their midst. According to all that I show you regarding the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of its furnishings, so are you to make it." Where did the Israelites get all these things? From the Egyptians. God had commanded through Moses that the people ask the Egyptians for gold and silver and clothing, and the Egyptians, urgent to be rid of these plague-ridden people, complied. Right? So they're like, "Please take everything we have, just leave. We cannot stand the frogs and the gnats any longer." Please, we'll give you all that we have. Depart. St. Augustine, in his typical fashion, saw in this not only the literal history of God's people, but also a metaphorical prototype for the cultural rites of the kingdom of God with respect to all other holidays. Whatever is good, whatever is true, whatever is beautiful has a place in Christian culture. In much the same way as the human heart stands in constant need of conversion, though, the works of man's heart and hands often need transforming. The good elements of all human culture need the life-giving power of the divine word, the life-giving shaping of the divine potter's hands. That is, good art and culture can only be produced when the culture builders offer their gifts to God and look to him for direction in their disposal. And so we turn back to Moses. Moses spends quite a while in conversation with God. He receives from the Lord instructions not only for the fashioning of the tabernacle and the ark, but also for lampstands, tables, veils, altars, the court of the tabernacle, oil for the lamps, and priestly vestments. He does not, as in the case of Noah's building the ark, however, have Moses do the work himself. Rather, he tells Moses that he has selected various artisans from among the people, endowing them with the skill and understanding to undertake the Lord's design. So chief among these is this guy called Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. I have filled him with a divine spirit of skill and understanding and knowledge in every craft. So God gives the people not only a plan or idea for the cultural apparatus which will serve them in worshiping him as they journey toward the promised land, he also draws from among their ranks the necessary skill for putting that plan into action. That is, he supplies inspiration. And all real inspiration is the breath of the Spirit within us. With this, it's worth noting the Lord also gives instructions on the priesthood and the Sabbath. From the beginning, art and culture have been tied to rest, the true festivity wherein we not only refrain from labor, but rejoice in the presence of the Lord, the presence which is the key to all true artistic and cultural accomplishment. But again, we tend to mess things up. So the Israelites, like many of us, right, where we are listening some character hold forth on a Tuesday evening in March, right, we start to wonder, when is this going to end, right? So like they turn to Aaron and they say, look, Aaron, we don't know about this Moses guy. We know that the Red Sea parted. We know all these plagues, all these miracles happened, but he's been up there a long time, and we've got to get to the promised land. You know, we've got a 40 years journey ahead of us. We would like to get underway here. Could you please give us another God? Because this one is he's taking too long in the instructions, so we need to get moving. All right. So of course Aaron says, all right, give me your stuff. Right. So they take the gold, right? The gold that was meant to be for all the things that God has just given instructions for. And Aaron, of course, fashions it into this calf, which they then worship in a sort of riotous celebration. Now, I'm always very amused by this story because it's just hilarious to me the way that Aaron puts it. Because Moses comes back down and he's like, Aaron, what happened? And Aaron's like, I don't know. I threw this gold in the fire and this calf just kind of came out. So, yeah, I don't know what to tell you, boss man. Sorry. Moses is not amused, right? As he's coming down the mountain, of course, he hears the sound, and they think at first that it's the sound of warfare, right? Like there's this crazy battle happening down in the camp. And Moses is like, no, that's just the people partying like crazy. So they get down there. Right, they find the people having this riotous affair, dancing about this golden calf. Right, Moses is not happy. He burns the idol, grinds it to powder, scatters this in water, and has the people drink it. Now, of course, it's only once atonement has been made that the people can move on, proceeding with God's plan of worship, building the tabernacle and the ark and all its trappings. But there's a curious parallel here to the case of the prodigal son. Right, so we all know the story of the prodigal son. The one son leaves, he takes his inheritance, he says, Dad, I wish you were dead so that I could have my money, right? Tells that to his father. His father's like, all right, son, I understand, here's your money, have fun. Son leaves, he comes back, it's a great moment. And yet, we sometimes tend to forget that now they all have to live together again. And now they only have half of the substance that they had before, right? There's something similar in the story of the golden calf here. right? That now they still have to follow out the instructions that God has given to Moses for how to build all these things that are going to form the fabric of their worship. But now they've lost all those materials that they gave up for the golden calf, right? So now they have less to give to the Lord in this process of journeying through the desert, of learning to worship God once again. This, I think, is the fundamental cultural and artistic choice set before us by faith. Do we, living in the midst of a moribund, hostile, decadent culture, avail ourselves of the resources of that culture only to squander ourselves? Or do we draw what is good out of that culture and turn our eyes, hearts, and minds to God, waiting patiently to hear what He would have us do with it? Weak as we are, we can hardly help squandering the riches God sets before us, unless we take advantage of the grace which awaited the people of Israel in the coming of the Messiah. Along the way, throughout the rest of Old Testament history, we see the continuation of the pattern of oscillation between squandering of resources in the service of false idols and the dedication of resources in the service of God, culminating in a way in Solomon's construction of the temple in Jerusalem. This astonishing structure is the fruit of Solomon's wisdom, employing the riches of all the nearby cultures, such as the cedars of Lebanon, the gold of Parvaim. The temple, which incorporates images of all the cosmos, from water to angels, reminds us that all of creation was built by God to be a temple, a forum of worship. And so all genuine culture must be tied to worship. For centuries, through invasions, destructions, and reconstructions, the temple would be the place where Israel would convene to worship God. But something strange happened. When Roman power had spread over the world, once again oppressing God's children, threatening the way of life, God took the extraordinary measure of entering into His artwork, not merely by His power, not merely by force of His ceaseless causality, but in person, body and blood, soul and divinity. And we recall what He said of the temple of His body, the temple which was rebuilt in 3 days in the resurrection, and which still stands now, though the temple in Jerusalem has vanished, right? And this Christ's body, the church, will stand until the end of time. Strangest of all, from our own small, often crabbed and craven perspective, is the fact that in the Eucharist, Christ has joined us to that eternal temple. The ever-living cornerstone has extended His life to us, drawing us into an organic unity with Himself, so that we have no temple as Israel had. We have indeed, as Minucius Felix put it, no temples and no altars, but rather we ourselves are the temple. Clement of Alexandria said, "What I am calling a temple is not a building, but a gathering of the elect." This is all very well, and everything we've covered so far, from Genesis to the Gospels, more or less reduces to the simple point that true art and true culture can only ever come about through listening to God's voice, to turning our gaze to Him to receive the light of the divine Son, the light of the Word, through whom alone we can truly come to see. What the question of art and culture boils down to ultimately is that if we want to build a culture, we need to become saints. In an age of recipes, instruction manuals, YouTube tutorials, government programs, and action plans, we always want formulas, step-by-step instructions for how to remake civilization. But the formula has never changed. Right? If you were what you were meant to be, right, as St. Catherine of Siena said, you would set the world ablaze. And the devil once told St. John Vianney that if there were 4 men on earth like St. John, right, that Satan's power would have been broken in that very age. Just 4 men of that saintliness. That would be all it would take to destroy Satan's kingdom on earth. If we turn our eyes from the darkness of our culture and toward the light of God, we will reflect that light, scattering the darkness around us. The culture we are called to build is the culture of God's kingdom, the culture of the resurrection, the culture of the Spirit. The spiritual depth Christ has opened for us, however, does not mean the abandonment of the physical, and hence the need to form a concrete culture that embodies the life of the heavenly kingdom here on earth. True, the Israelites look to the promised land for their fulfillment, while we see in heaven the fulfillment of the promised land. But it is always worth reminding ourselves that heaven is a physical reality as well as a spiritual one. That is the place where the resurrected Christ reigns body and soul, and that when the end of time comes and God is all in all, we will find ourselves worshiping in the jeweled circuits of the heavenly Jerusalem. What then do we do on a practical level to bring about the culture of the kingdom here on earth? What does it look like when, looking at the Lord, we rejoice in him and seek to offer back to him something of his beauty. In the first place, we should remember not to be afraid and to take advantage of what is good in our surrounding culture. This is in many cases what the early Christians did with respect to Roman culture. The Roman basilicas, primarily legal and civic structures, became the pattern for the Roman churches, which still offer us stately, luminous reminders of God's power to preserve us amid the floods of time. The Roman language became the language of the church. Pagan temples became places of Christian worship, with Hadrian's Pantheon becoming perhaps the most famous example. Here we have another, a former temple to the goddess Minerva, converted to a church in Assisi. And the Roman roads, with the peaceful Mediterranean of Roman naval authority, became the highways over which the gospel spread. One of the finest artistic examples of the way in which secular culture can be wedded to and purified by Christian culture is in Dante's Divine Comedy, the poet's epic journey through hell, purgatory, and heaven. Dante's God, through the first nearly 2/3 of that journey, is Virgil, the Roman poet who lived at the time of Christ and who wrote the Aeneid, one of Dante's great classical guide texts. Throughout the poem's 14,233 lines, we watch as Dante weaves together Virgil and Augustine, Ovid and Aquinas, Orestes and the Blessed Virgin Mary. The beauties of this world, whether those of revelation or those of man groping for God, are all part of God's plan to teach us to love beauty itself. And artistic triumphs like the Divine Comedy or the plays of Shakespeare or the paintings of Raphael, particularly the lovely images in the Stanza della Senectura, can train us in how to draw what is good from the surrounding cultures. Right? So the very famous images of Raphael, which combine classical Christian imagery with those of pagan antiquity. We should also remember to dream big, even to the point of committing to projects we might never see fulfilled. Dante barely lived to finish the Divine Comedy. St. Thomas Aquinas left his Summa incomplete, as did Flannery O'Connor her last novel. And this is to say nothing of the construction of the great medieval cathedrals like Notre Dame or Chartres. Not a single person alive at the time construction began on Notre Dame would live to see the cathedral completed. There's perhaps some contemporary parallel in La Sagrada Familia of Gaudí in Barcelona, which was begun in 1882 and remains not quite complete. But for the most part, we like to get things done and get them done quickly. Once our plans are laid, we like to see them brought to perfection. And it is, of course, a good thing to seek the good with haste. But we might also do well to look to those who have gone before us and emulate their capacity for undertaking massive projects in hope, remembering that we are building for eternity. Developing this capacity for building culture on a lasting scale also involves looking to the past to develop our own appreciation of the beautiful and the sublime. And the beautiful, St. Thomas says, is that which, having been seen, pleases. That's a characteristically simple definition, but it's one which deftly incorporates the several elements of aesthetic appreciation, which is both sensual and intellectual, which requires the harmony of our eyes and our minds. Beauty pleases the heart. As Plato put it, here man's life becomes fully worth living, for here he beholds the divine, revealed in the purity of beauty itself. Through this he becomes immortal. But because we are creatures of habit, it is important that we develop good habits where beauty is concerned. It is all too easy to become enamored of false beauties, and so to engage in idolatry rather than worship. Cultivating a sense of the sublime can help us to remain faithful to true beauty. Whereas the beautiful pleases us, sets us at ease, the sublime exalts us by the very process of overwhelming us. Right? So if you've ever walked out into the desert at night and seen the vastness of the stars there, right? It's something that's overwhelming, right? To consider how vast space is, right? And yet, there's something even more overwhelming in considering that our minds are even more vast, that our minds can take in that vastness and expand to those limits and beyond, right? There's a similar feeling when we walk into a place like St. Peter's Basilica, right? Which just overwhelms us with how large it is, with how many people can be in there at once, right? And yet, we realize that this is something made by human hands, right? And so we're both overwhelmed and exalted by this experience of the sublime. Looking to the history of the church, as well as to the artistic tradition it has inspired, can help us to cultivate this aesthetic sense, a sense we desperately need if we wish to be disciples of beauty in the service of culture. In addition to looking for inspiration to the church throughout the ages, we might also look to the future generations, doing everything in our power to equip them to be artists and renewers of culture. Too often, even as we sigh for a better culture, for better art, for better music, we shy away from fostering our children's artistic and cultural development. Fiction, painting, music, all these things we tend to say are decent enough as hobbies, but eventually they must be left behind for the activities of the real world. But it's precisely this attitude, one which prizes the useful rather than the beautiful, the productive rather than the contemplative, work rather than festivity, which has led to our present cultural state. We cannot serve both God and mammon, and we cannot teach our children to love God while worshiping the golden calf. By fostering beauty in our homes, though, we have the capacity to produce true artists capable of bringing to birth in our world the designs of the heavenly Jerusalem. Then, too, we should remember that our work is intergenerational. Scripture tells us that the good a man does will resound through 1,000 generations, and that the evil will echo through 3 or 4. So whether we build churches or paint frescoes or write icons or compose symphonies or not, we can, by doing good, shape the culture we leave behind. This involves, perhaps most urgently, strengthening the family, beginning with shoring up our own families. There are few things which exert a more powerful influence over the imagination of a child than the sight of his parents in prayer and the sight of his parents smiling at him. In prayer, in turning our eyes to God, we learn how good the world is because we learn the goodness of the one who made the world. And when our children see us smiling at them, they learn to feel the smile of the Father who looks upon his children with such love. Jesus asked what father among us would hand his child a stone when he asks for a loaf of bread, or a snake when he asks for a fish. Well, I've never, I confess, handed my children a stone or a snake, but I have sadly handed them silence when they ask for my voice. Right, or I've handed them an excuse when they ask me to play. Looking to the Father and reflecting the Father's glance to the world is one of the greatest means by which we can train artists. For art as a function of culture is always on some level the pouring forth of a soul who has seen something of the goodness of God. St. Augustine tells us that only the lover sings. When we are in love, we spontaneously burst into song. When we see something beautiful, as when Adam saw Eve, we feel as though we have finally been given back to ourselves. We come to know that we are fearfully, wonderfully made. We come to know ourselves as a gift, and we desire to give ourselves in return, to sing, to paint, to sculpt, to honor a spouse, to raise a child. Naturally, all of these things require sacrifice. Plato described the way of beauty as a kind of conception and giving birth. Beauty calls to us, asking us to give something of ourselves, to beget more beauty and bring it into being. Beauty asks us to die to ourselves. And indeed, the urge to have children is itself, in part, the call of the next generation, reminding us that we will die. This way is hard, and yet it is filled with joy. The joy of St. Francis of Assisi lying in the snow, the joy of Saints Perpetua and Felicity, ecstatic in the midst of their martyrdom, the happiness even of Christ on the cross, fulfilling the Father's will and giving himself to the last drop for his beloved. The song of the cross is the music of the church. It is a music we can only hear if we cultivate silence. C.S. Lewis muses that music and silence are the two things which can never be found in hell. In every age, the music of the cross has given those who cultivate silence ears to hear, so that whatever our surrounding culture, whatever the apparent darkness in which we find ourselves, we can never go beyond the light of the divine sun. Our task in creating true art, in building true culture, is simply to raise our eyes to that light, turning the windows of our souls to those rays so that they'll be reflected to our world. And in the fullness of time, that light will be all in all, when the faithful take their places in the heart of God's artistry, in the heavenly Jerusalem, where the Lamb will be our lamp, and we will join the unceasing chorus of praise. It is easy enough to forget, in the midst of the darkness our world presents, that the rhythm of the cross underlies the wild, ecstatic melody of the resurrection. The victory is won, and we, the body, are following the head into that eternal glory of the streets of the heavenly city. And so the last thing I propose, if we would foster art and culture in a spirit of faith, is that we do everything we can to renew our celebration of the Lord's Day. Art and culture are functions of festivity, And the greatest festivity available to us is the Sunday liturgy, where in the here and now we partake of the festivity of heaven. If we want to learn to listen to the Lord, to hear his voice so that we can know how to employ the things of our culture in his service, to train our children in the way of beauty, to strengthen our families against cultural decadence, renewed celebration of the Lord's Day is absolutely critical. The meaning of celebration, says Joseph Pieper, is man's affirmation of the universe and his experiencing the world in an aspect other than its everyday one. Now, we cannot conceive a more intense affirmation of the world than praise of the Creator of this very world. We are made to contemplate God's beauty forever, yet we struggle to do so for even an hour. Drawn away from the present by anxiety of the past and the future, we withhold ourselves from the joy of the present moment. In the liturgy, though, and in joyful celebration of Sunday, we can allow ourselves to be made new. We can learn to look with the eyes of the divine artist upon the world, so that we can rejoice in the world, in ourselves, and in the God from whom all art, all faith, all culture proceeds. Thank you. I think we have maybe some time for questions. I'll certainly be glad to hang around for anybody who would like to chat for a while. A couple of other things. So outside, I do have copies of, most importantly, Joie de Vivre, which is the journal I edit. I think it's really poised to be a sort of wellspring of beauty and contemplation in our South Louisiana community. So I do have copies of that if anybody would like to purchase those or perhaps get a subscription to it. It's a quarterly print journal, though we also have online materials that we publish on a more or less weekly basis. And then I've got a few copies of my books out there as well, if anyone's interested. But I would love to hear from y'all now. What questions do you have? Yes, ma'am.
How do you teach high schoolers the types of things it's so very interesting to hear all this, but it's got to be a real challenge to be talking to a 15-year-old on this level. So interesting.
That's a great question. I wish I had a better answer than I find that doing a lot of crazy voices and antics to kind of keep their attention are useful. I find also that I'm always amazed by the boys, right? So I teach, my guys are anywhere from 14 to 17, and they never cease to astonish me. Now, I mean, sometimes they astonish me by how just like crazy and ridiculous they are, but they have a wonderful capacity to rejoice in the world around them. And I'm always humbled by how receptive they are to me, kind of in all of my sort of daily weaknesses and failings as a teacher. But I don't know, there's something about them that I think draws teaching out of people in a way. There's I think always between teachers and students, there's some echo in some way of a parent and child relationship, right? There's a way in which students looking at you, I think prompts a kind of love, which makes it, again, I'm not saying much of the practical day-to-day means of getting things across to them, which is difficult, right? And many times, so we just finished reading A Streetcar Named Desire. I don't know if anybody's ever read that great Tennessee Williams play. But I often feel very appreciated by Blanche, the main character, when she says that she has the misfortune of being a high school English instructor. So the boys, it's funny, whenever we read that in class, the boys always look at me, they're like, that's like you, Mr. Fitz. That's hilarious. But yeah, I think the boys really, in themselves, like in their kind of fundamental openness, their kind of fundamental joy, which sometimes takes drawing out, but I think they bring the best out of me a lot of times. Yes?
Yeah, I've never, well, let me put it this way. I kind of understand the goals, purpose, and use of, let's just say, science and religion. I've never figured out what are the goals, purpose, use, or whatever. I've never figured out what art is from that sort of perspective. Do you have any answers for that?
I think the primary means whereby art works with religion is number one, that art gives us an experience of the life of God himself, right? So God is fundamentally created, right? He rejoices in himself. So the Father, looking at the Son, rejoices. The two of them rejoice in each other in the Holy Spirit, and they desire to give something, they desire to share that love even beyond the bounds of themselves, right? And so for the person who creates art, there's a sense of sharing in the experience of the divine joy in the other. And for the person who contemplates art, likewise, there's a sense of, so like when I read the end of The Great Gatsby, I can never get through the last sentence without shivering, without almost bursting into tears. Because there's a way when I read those lines, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. I feel that someone has just spoken to me, that is you. That is your experience of life. Right? Now, what does that for different people might vary. The Great Gatsby might mean nothing to a lot of people, right? But for me, it's something that really reaches me. I think when a work of art touches us in that way, we have the experience of being seen by the other, right? So when Adam and Eve look at each other, right, and in each other they see themselves. At last, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. When I see a great work of art, at last, here is another human soul revealing itself to me. There's that. On a more practical level, perhaps, we are creatures with a lot of different faculties, right? So we have intellect, we have senses, we have passions, and we have an imagination, which kind of combines a lot of those things, right? So my imagination requires both my senses and my intellect. Now, often the reason I go wrong in life is because of a conflict between different parts of me. So, for example, I know that I should be in my hour of prayer right now, or something. But I'm very hungry, and so I get up and I leave and I go get a cheeseburger. Now that's a very base level example, right? But the way that art works can really form us morally is by helping to focus our attention, right? So even the way that like a church is designed, right? When I go to church on Sunday, it's very easy to get distracted by many things around me. But the design of the church is meant to direct my attention back, right? So when I start to look at the toddler over here who's being really cute, I get distracted by that. But then I see an image, I see a statue of a saint gesturing like this, right? And that gesture directs my eyes back to the altar, back to the tabernacle. So I think art has also that imaginative moral capacity, right, to put us back on the right track, to harmonize our different faculties in order to let us be whole, right, to let us be kind of integrated in our intellect, our imagination, our senses, our appetites, our passions. And that's, of course, it takes a certain cultivation, right? It takes practice for us to allow art to form us in that way, right? But of course, it's not a language that we very commonly speak, right? So we're not a culture that recognizes symbols very easily anymore, right? But yeah, I think those would be sort of my initial responses. Sir, I think you had
Yeah, that was a wonderful lecture. Thank you so very much. Can you provide a list of the artists whom you selected?
I can.
And then
I'll be happy to do
all
that.
the art you showed is representational art. Do you find any spirituality in non-representational art?
Yes. I think often it requires more time for me as a consumer of art to parse out, oftentimes. So representational art has the great benefit, of course, of kind of like immediately giving you something to latch on to. But I think, so for example, so I like to go to the art museum here in City Park. There are two paintings that I really like. They're right next to each other. So one is by Vasily Kandinsky, who's sort of world famous, like 20th century megastar of the art world. And next to him is a painting by a guy named Will Henry Stevens, who was I believe he was a professor at Tulane for many years. And their paintings have a sort of like, these sort of geometric abstractions, but they just mesmerize me. And I have this feeling when I am able to go there, usually when I'm not with my children, and just sort of stand there before them, that there's a way in which they kind of set me at ease, right? Which I think very often what good art can do for us is to kind of take us out of the anxiety of the everyday moment and set us at our ease.
Thank you.
I would agree if you could give us a list of the art. That'd be very interesting. I also was very interested in how, for your presentation, you chose the different pieces of art that you showed in the presentation. And the second part is to add to this question. I find the art, for me, helps tell the story because I think I'm a visual learner. So when I see the word summer and I hear Father Pat or whoever speak of it, it visualizes in my mind. And I think of painting a picture that I've seen with that. It helps me better meditate and understand that in my mind.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That it does have such narrative power very often. So I mean, I essentially, as far as how I selected the works, I had the text written, and then I had some images kind of in mind already, but a lot of it was just sort of searching the internet, going through. I mean, mostly just using Google and kind of following different rabbit holes to find different representations of some of the pieces I wanted to touch on.
That'd be a lot of work.
That was fun. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Yes, ma'am.
You said a minute ago that you feel like your Jesuit students draw the best out of you. And I can well imagine that you draw the best out in them. And, I can imagine a lot of teachers of high school boys who would feel like, oh, these knuckleheads are never going to be able to relate to this. And you give them credit for being able to appreciate the subject matter. You are a mesmerizing speaker. These boys need more teachers like you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Once again, let's thank Danny for as he mentioned, we'll be here, and Teresa said she went to go make some more cocktails out there. So, and Danny was there. And next week we'll have the fourth of our sessions here with Dr. Con Neal from the seminary talking about pop culture and mysticism. And those of you who've heard Tom Neal speak before know that he is a very good speaker. And so invite your friends to come out and continue what has really been something very special. And I appreciate Danny being here tonight. Thank you. So have a good evening. Stay around and have a few drinks and just don't